Good morning. Okay, it dried. I had a little bit of I decided to carry my son a little bit this morning, who decided to expel some of his, second breakfast? Second breakfast out on my shirt. So, I think I'm good. Tonight, during our night service, we're still going through our church history study, and tonight we're going through English separatists and where exactly we came from as Baptists, as specifically as Southern Baptists, where our lineage comes from. You remember last week we actually talked about King Henry VIII and the English Reformation and King Henry VIII's many wives, some of whom were more lucky than others. But tonight we're going to continue on that study, and we're going to go through English separatists and what exactly they contributed specifically to the ideas of church autonomy and separation of church and state. We're going to talk a little bit about where those ideas came from and why they're important today. So join us tonight at 6 o'clock. Last week, we started this little chunk right here by talking about the importance of the internal part of faith. But it doesn't just stop there. Faith is more than just head knowledge. Faith is more than just knowing it's true. And today we're going to look a little bit at that as we turn to Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 46. And Jesus continues on in his lesson to his disciples. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things I say? I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. When the flood came, the river crashed against that house and couldn't shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The river crashed against it, and immediately it collapsed, and the destruction of that house was great." We begin today by going back through this progression and reviewing what we've learned thus far with this sermon. I know I sound a little bit like a broken record, but we really have to see what Jesus is doing here and what the progression is to get this entire big picture here with this sermon. Since this is one big sermon, we need to know all of it going through. And so we're reminded of what Jesus is doing here with this sermon. Jesus is teaching his disciples how to be like him, his apostles, his representatives, on how to be like him because they are his representatives, because they're going to take his name out to the world. They have to be like Jesus if they're going to represent Jesus. So Jesus starts off this entire sermon right here, not by going in and teaching them, but starts it off by teaching them by example and on how to care for people. But then he looks at them and he goes, "All right, now I'm going to start verbally teaching you guys." In the beginning of this sermon here, where Jesus begins to teach his apostles on how they should live in order to be like Jesus, more so to please the one they're representing. And that's when he tells these people, his disciples, that there are actually two camps in this world. And everyone is really in one of these two camps. There's no other options. There's no middle ground in this. You're one or the other. First, there are those who are blessed. And then there are those who have woes attached to them. There are those who in the first camp are poor in spirit but have spiritual blessings. They will suffer because of the persecution, because of other things in this life, but they are still blessed by God. Why? Because they are the ones to recognize that they are poor in spirit, that they have nothing to offer before God. And so they hunger after the things of God. And in response, God gives them himself. God gives them exactly what they're asking for. But because they seek after God, they will suffer in this life, and they will be persecuted, but they will be blessed. God will see them rewarded and compensated for what they go through in this life. They will get exactly what they are asking for. They will get God. The poor in spirit are those who have spiritual blessings, even though they suffer in this life. Even though they face difficult times, they will still have God's favor, which is exactly what they're looking for. And yet there are those who have these woes attached to them. The second camp, 4 woes attached to this group of people. There are those who believe they are rich, believe they have it all down, and because of that, they don't think they need God. They think they're full and not hungry, not realizing that they are spiritually starving themselves. They don't think they need God, and they don't think they need God to fill this void in their lives, so they try filling this void with different things that will never fill. And they think they're full with the pleasures of this life when they're really starving. And because of their lifestyle and their rejection of God and their absolute hatred of God, they look at those who seek after God and they hate them as well. They are the ones who are persecuting those who seek after God. Not only that, but they lift up people who speak against God, who are false prophets, who are false teachers. They lift up these people while persecuting those who are actually seeking after God. And to these people are given woes by God, for eventually they will get exactly what's coming. Eventually, they will get exactly what they're asking for. But in the meantime, Jesus tells his apostles, these people who should be at least in the camp of those who are poor in spirit. The camp of those who are poor in spirit are those who follow after Christ. And the people who have the woes attached to them in that camp are the ones who reject God entirely. He tells his apostles are the ones who should be those who are poor in spirit to recognize their need before God and seek after God. And with that, he tells his apostles this, something interesting. Instead of hating those who persecute them, instead of hating their enemies, what should they do? They need to love their enemies. And they are to love their enemies by being merciful and gracious towards their enemies. Merciful in the sense that they are withholding judgment that's rightfully deserved, and they are withholding judgment against them, and they're being gracious by giving them favor that is not deserved, giving them good favor that these people don't deserve. And this goes hand in hand with the next part of the passage that Jesus teaches, where he says not to be judgmental or condemning of them. Judgmental in a sense that the apostles are not to be judging the eternal state of people. They are not to be condemning people. They have no right to condemn people. They are to be merciful and gracious towards people. That means the apostles cannot ever consider someone a lost cause. No one's ever a lost cause. But instead they are to love them by being merciful and gracious. And they are not allowed to pass sentence or condemn these people because the apostles are sinners too. And that's what Jesus is trying to tell them. They've got no right to tell someone's eternal state and consider them a lost cause, because that would render them lost causes too. They're just as much sinners as the rest of them. They're not to be hypocritical like those who persecute them, like the Pharisees who teach false things to people, who teach legalism and heresy, who are the real hypocrites. The apostles are not to be like them. Instead, they are to be people who are continuously looking inward, as the Scriptures later puts it, working out their own salvation. And that starts internally. And that's really what this is all about. As Jesus is teaching them these things, he goes on with what we talked about last week, with the good trees and bad trees, and what good trees produce and what bad trees produce. But the bottom line is you're able to tell a good tree from a bad tree from the fruit they produce. But it all starts right here. All of these good things that Jesus is telling them to be like, be merciful, be gracious, be loving, be like me. That doesn't start with action. That starts right here. And that's where it all begins. It's what's going on internally. And that was the point last week. You can do all the good acts in the world, but if you're not right with God in here, it's irrelevant. Jesus explains that it's what's going on in the heart that matters. That's the first part, real part of faith. That faith doesn't start with action. Faith real faith, good faith, starts with what's going on internally. This is how you tell a good tree from a bad tree. His apostles are to be like the good trees that produce good fruit. Good trees produce good fruit. Good men produce good works because of the treasure that's put in their hearts. They're to put good treasure in their hearts so that good will manifest. If you put good treasure in there and you treasure that which is in your hearts, then good will manifest. And good, we remember from last week, good is what's defined by God, not humanity. Humans don't get to define what good is. Humans are terrible judges of what good is. We can look through human history and see that. We are not good judges of what good and evil actually is. God is the judge of what is good and what is evil. God gets to decide what is good and what is evil, not us. Good is godly things. So this good treasure that Jesus points out is really people who put godly things in their hearts. So what Jesus is saying is put godly things and treasure them in your hearts, and from that will come good. Faith begins internally, not externally. Faith begins with putting God back on the throne of your heart and putting the things of Him and storing the things away from Him in our hearts through His Word and prayer, as well as communing with other believers and communing back with Him. Faith begins right here. Not with even condemning the world or with even doing supposed good acts, because good acts are rendered meaningless when what's going on here isn't right. Faith, good faith, true faith begins internally by putting the things of God in our hearts and putting God back on the throne that He rightfully deserves. But then we come to today and see that with that comes an external manifestation of true faith. What happens when we truly put God in our hearts and put the things of God in our hearts? Jesus begins by asking His disciples, "Why do you call me Lord if you don't do what I say?" First, we have to understand something. What a Lord actually is in biblical terms. Because when we think of Lord, obviously the first thing we think of is that guy in a medieval costume, and he sits in his castle with his subjects all around, his people all around, this Lord and his vassal, and he tells people what to do, and sometimes it works out, and sometimes they get a rebellion on their hands, and we think of this medieval idea of a Lord. But when we look at the biblical idea of Lord, it's even deeper because of who this is representing and what is really going on here. You see, this is something so much more. Lord in biblical terms refers to a master. A Lord is someone who has not just authority, but ownership. Master. We need to realize that right here. We sometimes, especially in this country, we put a lot of stock on our rights and our rights in this country. Can I tell you something? In the eyes of God, you have no rights. You have zero rights in the eyes of God. None. Zip. We are a creation. God is master. Period. End of discussion. His will is the only thing that matters in that discussion. God has ownership. We are the creation. And that should be the end of the story. Unfortunately, humans have decided to rebel against God. And that's where we've ended up here in this story and here today. And so Jesus comes down, and His disciples are around Him, and they call Him Lord. But he brings up a good question. Why do you call me Lord? Why do you call me Master? Why do you say I have authority and ownership over you, but you don't do what I say? It seems ridiculous to call him Lord and not do what he says. Is that a real master? If you had a master, if you had someone who had ownership over you, would you be able to tell that person no? Of course not. It's absolutely ridiculous to call yourself a disciple if you're not going to follow what Jesus actually says. What he's telling the disciples, if you really want to call me master, you need to do what I say. Otherwise, I'm not really your master, am I? But he doesn't just stop there and just say it's ridiculous to call him Lord and not treat him as such. No. He starts and then gives them an example. Jesus gives an example of what will happen with people who listen to him and do what he says, and gives an example of what people who don't listen to him are like and what will happen to them. Now, I'm actually going to start off here a little bit backwards. We're actually going to start off with the person who doesn't listen. Problem person first, then we're going to get to the other side of this. There's people who either don't listen or don't do what the Lord says. We remember that there are those within this group, the group that Jesus originally spoke of in this sermon, those who think they are spiritually rich, who think they have it all down, who think that they don't need God. And so, because they don't think they need God, they really don't think they need Jesus either. And God gives them these woes. The woes are directed towards them because they think they're spiritually rich, and so they disregard Jesus entirely, and they push him and his words to the side. And these are also the bad trees. We talked about the bad trees last message. Bad trees have bad treasure in their hearts because good treasures are everything from God and Jesus, and these people have rejected that. They instead put in their hearts treasure that is bad, that is worldly, that is everything. Idolatry is everything that is focused that's not God, that you put in your hearts to fill a void that can only be filled by God, to put something else on that throne inside your hearts that isn't God, because that's God's rightful place. Anything that you put over God is an idol. And that's bad treasure being put in your hearts. And these people right here are disregarding Jesus. They've disregarded the very definition of good. And instead they've put everything else in their hearts but God. And from that comes bad things, come evil things. These people are bad trees who have put bad treasure in their hearts. But more than that, there are some bad trees who have even heard Jesus. They know exactly what he's talking about. The Pharisees being one of those groups of people. These Pharisees, we remember, they followed Jesus around, not because they wanted to hear what he actually said, but because they wanted to trap him. The Pharisees heard Jesus. The teachers of the law, the Sadducees, heard Jesus. They knew what he was talking about. They knew what he meant. They knew what he was saying. But yet they hate Jesus. So they might hear him, and they might even take some of his words. They might even think, there are some who actually, within this group, think they are actual followers of Jesus. One in particular, we remember at the end of the list of 12 apostles comes one name, a traitor who would eventually betray Jesus. Someone even within their camp who they all thought was a follower, but when it came down to it, this wasn't right. There are those who hear Jesus, but they don't actually consider him Lord or Master. There are those who might like Jesus, but he's not Lord for them. And this is where Jesus says they are like the man who builds a house without a foundation. Now, we all live in Roseburg, and we know how I've heard it, or I've heard so much from you guys, and I've experienced it now after buying a house, the issue of black mud in this town. Good grief. The fact that homes crack like crazy here because black mud is terrible to try to build a foundation on to begin with. Now let me put a idea behind you. What would you say if someone told you they were going to build a house on down near the Harvard area, probably close to the river, but weren't going to build a foundation on it? How stupid is that? That's ridiculous. You don't build a house without a foundation. You don't build a structure without a foundation. What happens to the house? Obviously, it's going to fall apart. But that's what these people are like. They build a house without a foundation. Without foundation, first, the house is weak. It has a weak structure. It has a weak base. It has weak integrity. It's a weak house. It's the opposite of strong. It's the opposite of everything that's good. It's not a good house. It's a terrible house. The man who builds without a foundation, they have built a weak house. And a weak house is a dangerous house. A weak house is prone to disaster. A weak house is prone to bad things happening to it. A weak house is prone to danger. A weak house is a dangerous house because when calamity comes, the house is going to go along with it. And that's exactly what happens. So here we have a man. Goes down near Harvard, builds a house without a foundation, close to the river, close to the North Umpqua. And the river starts flooding. And all of a sudden the waters come up. What's going to happen to the house? House comes tumbling down, folks. And that's exactly what happens because Jesus says a flood comes upon this house. And what happened? The house was destroyed. The house was devastated. Why? Because the house was weak. It couldn't take the water. It couldn't take the disaster. It couldn't take the flood because it didn't have a foundation. And the water that came in was too strong and it wiped the house away. It couldn't take the disaster that came upon it. The house could not stand against the flood because there was no foundation. The house was weak and was dangerous. It was prone to this disaster. So when the disaster came, it took it away. And it says the destruction of this house was great. And think about it for a second. Because here's this man who built his house without a foundation. And what is he left with at the end? Nothing. Nothing. Everything he put stock in, this house, was all swept away in an instant. You know what, it amazes me. I actually, one of the things that I've seen a bunch of times, I don't know if you've all seen it, the 2004 tsunami videos. Has anyone watched those? Or the 2011 Japanese tsunami that came through? What happened to a lot of those buildings? You see houses and houses being taken away by this flood. And we see people left behind wailing over the destruction that's left in the path of this flood. And we think for a second, the man who thought he was rich, the man who thought he's made this great house, this big house, and here comes the flood, and was left with nothing when disaster came. And that's really what his house was. Nothing. He built it without a foundation, a weak house, and it was destined for destruction. The man was left with nothing. But on the other hand, there are those who listen to Jesus, and they do what he says. These are the ones who are poor in spirit, who know they need God, and they hunger after God. They hunger after the things of Jesus. And so they seek after Him. And more than that, they not only seek Jesus, but they do what He says. They know who He is, they believe in Jesus, and they put the things of Jesus in their hearts. And from that comes good. These people are the good trees who put Jesus in their hearts, who put the treasure of God in their hearts. And from their hearts, good is produced. And that good is produced because of something very simple. And that is, they not only hear the words of Jesus, but they do it. They do what Jesus said. It's not enough just to read over the words of Jesus. And Jesus makes this clear in this passage right here. These people right here do what Jesus says. They don't just hear His words. They hear it and they take it and they put it in their hearts and then they do it. Their belief and knowledge becomes action. Now, what are they like? What are they like? They're like the man who builds his house with a strong foundation. A man who builds his house right. We know a house with a strong foundation is strong, obviously. A house with the foundation is not going to be one that's shaking. A house with a strong foundation is not going to be prone to the same disaster that struck one without a foundation. A strong foundation is going to be safe. That's what a strong foundation, a strong house with a strong foundation really is. It is strong. It's a safe house. It's a safe haven. It's not going to be prone to disaster. It's going to stand strong and be safe for people. So when the same flood comes rushing in, the same flood that took this other man's house and washed it away, the same flood comes barreling in to this house with a foundation. What happens? The house stands strong. The house wasn't destroyed. The house's foundation was not damaged in the flood. The flood couldn't even shake this house, couldn't even shift it, because it was such a strong foundation that this house was built upon. It was so solid that the house it was built upon could not be shaken, and it stood. The house withstood the flood, and the man who built the house was still there. The flood came through, but he and his house was spared. The person that does what Jesus says is just like this person right here, who goes and he builds his house with a strong foundation, with this great foundation, so that when something like a flood comes, the house still stands strong. So when disaster comes, the house is not destroyed because of the foundation. This foundation that is really built on the words of Jesus. People, there will be a time when disaster does come. That's inevitable. We need to think ahead to the future. When God's judgment is poured out on humanity and the world. And He is just for doing so. Because this is His creation. And He gets the right to determine what to do with this world and with us. And we have for so long as a species turned our backs on our Creator. And in that time, creation itself cries out for justice. The disaster that Jesus speaks of, in my opinion, as I look at this text, is a representation of the coming judgment of God. A judgment that is inevitable. It is coming. The flood, in a way of speaking, the disaster is coming to wipe away all and make things right again. And all who have rejected God will find themselves in this great destruction, as all they hold dear will be wiped away. All this bad treasure that they put their stock into will all come up for nothing. People, when we die, we go up to heaven and face God, and it doesn't matter how much money you made. Doesn't matter how big your family is. Doesn't matter how many supposed good acts you did. There's only one question that matters. One that will not cause destruction. But these people who rejected God, they will look upon the place where they had built their houses without foundations, all the worldly things they put their hearts, and finally realize all of it was meaningless. They will be left with nothing and no one. And as they stare out at the emptiness that is left behind, they will see that without God, all of the things they put their hope into is pointless. They will not be spared the wrath of God, and their weak houses without foundations will be swept away. But that's not everyone. That's not everybody. Although we all deserve such a fate, God is still a merciful and gracious God. That's why Jesus came. That's why Jesus came. Yes, God has ownership. And God could have, right after Adam and Eve, wiped us all out, and would have been completely just to do so. But yet, Jesus came. But yet, Jesus died. But yet, Jesus rose again. Jesus didn't have to do any of these things. But He did, because God is a loving God and gave us a way out. Those who accept Jesus as Lord, call Him Master, and do what He says, will be spared. The foundation they built their houses on is Jesus, and it's His ways. So when the coming wrath comes forth, they will be spared because they built up their houses with the foundation of Jesus. The foundation begins with faith. And faith is more than just knowledge. It is belief that manifests into action. The old saying goes, put your money where your mouth is. If you really say you're a Christian, you will do what Jesus says. There are too many people in this world who say, I love Jesus, but they don't do what He says. There are too many people in this world who say they love the words of Jesus, but they don't have a relationship with Jesus. There are even a ton of people who've said, yeah, I accepted Christ as a kid, but you can't tell their lives apart from the rest of the world. They might have been baptized, but they don't follow Jesus, some of whom haven't darkened the doors of a church in 20 years. They're not saved. Why? Because Jesus isn't Lord of their lives. Paul says this in Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. That's what faith is all about. It is about belief and action. There's an internal belief and an external action to this statement. Now, let me give you an example. I've done this example before. So this is a little bit of a review. Anybody want to be brave enough to volunteer? Anybody want to be brave enough to volunteer and come up here? Cheryl, come here. I love this. I can always count on Cheryl to be a good volunteer. Oh, you're fine. Cheryl?
Yes.
What is this?
Looks like a stool to me with
Stool.
4 legs.
Yeah, it is. That's right.
Thank you.
It's exactly what it is. If I told you to go sit on that stool, would it hold you?
I have faith that it would.
This is faith. This is faith right here. He knows it's a chair. That's what it is. He knows that this stool, this chair, can hold him. And so what does he do? He goes and sits on it. Because he believes that it will hold him. He believes that it will keep him up. And that's exactly what it does. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Pastor.
faith is internal that produces external. And Jesus says it right here. Those who want to call him Lord will do what he says. So are you going to do what Jesus says to do? It's a simple lesson for today. Do what Jesus says. We spoke last week about good trees producing good fruit. Good people do good works, and that good is godly things. Jesus is God, so he defines what is good because he is good. A good person is one who puts Jesus in their hearts. And from that, good fruit will come. What is that good fruit? It's doing what Jesus says to do. It's following him. And where does that start? With putting his words in our hearts. It's putting this in our hearts, like we talked about last week. You can't do what Jesus says if you don't know what he said to begin with. So we start with this right here, and we learn from his word. And it's putting Jesus and his word in our hearts. But it's more than that. It's about doing it as well. Our Wednesday night Bible study, I've been going through and teaching people how to read the Bible for themselves. And the last part of this is application. It's doing what the Bible tells you to do. And we've talked about the importance of this. And in the midst of it, I've illustrated, and I've talked to a couple of people about seminary today, but one of the most dangerous places to be a Christian, funny enough, is seminary. And people sit there and they go, wait a minute, what? You're around Christians, you're studying the Bible. How can that be a dangerous place to be a Christian? Let me explain to you why. Here's what happens, and here's how easy it is. Because in seminary and Bible college, you're taking the Bible and you're given biblical readings to do as homework. And so you sit there and you think to yourself, hey, I could kill two birds with one stone. I could put my devotional, my own personal time in the Word together with my homework. That seems like a good idea. And then what happens? More and more you do that, and the Bible starts becoming no longer something that changes your life, but all of a sudden it becomes a textbook. And so you take that out into the world. And when trouble comes, when disaster comes, and you're not actually doing the Word, the house gets swept away. And I've seen more and more guys coming out of Bible college and seminaries. And when disaster inevitably comes, their faith dies. I cannot emphasize the importance of this is more than just some intellectual book. This is something that is meant, that was given to us by God to change our lives, to show us the way that we can please Him, that we can be and grow closer to Him. This is meant to change our lives. This is the good treasure that we are meant to put in our hearts. And as we put this in our hearts, we should be doing it so that what is treasured in our hearts comes forth and manifests into action. We believe in Jesus. We believe in His words. We believe in the things that He has come to do, the things that He did do for us. We believe in His saving grace. So what are you going to do about it? It's not enough to sit there and have knowledge about it and go, yeah, that's great, and then go on living your life as if God doesn't exist. It's more. Are you going to let His word and His ways change your life? Are you going to do what Jesus says? Is He Lord of your life? Let's pray. Father God, we thank You, and we do pray that we can use Your word and put Your word into practice so that we can do what You tell us to do. Please give us your will, Father, through your word. Please give us the strength to follow your will in all things. In your name.